Hello everyone. Today we discussing the legal issues regarding podcasts and their distribution. Understanding legal requirements and effective distribution channels, of course, essential. Legal knowledge protects against risk related to intellectual property, content usage rights, and advertising regulations. By adhering to copyright and licensing laws and following sponsorship disclosure guidelines, podcasters safeguard their brand and content. Effective distribution ensures the podcast reaches the target audiences by selecting the right hosting platform, directories, and social media channel. Together, a strong legal foundation and a strategic distribution plan set the stage for growth and audience loyalty. So, key legal considerations for podcasters. First of all, of course, intellectual property IP. It protects the unique elements of your podcast, such as the brand name, logo, episode content, and any original music or artwork used. IP laws ensure that your podcast identity, unique, and creations are safeguarded against unauthorized use. Copyright is especially important as it covers original material like episodes, scripts, music, and artwork, giving you exclusive right over how the content is used and distributed. Registering copyrights and trademarks for crucial assets, including the podcast name and logo, provides legal protection, preventing others from imitating or misusing your brand. For example, trademarking your podcast name and logo safeguards your brand identity, while copyrighting episodes' content protects the originality of your material.
Hi, I'm Sari, here to answer your copyright questions. Today's topic is fair use. First, what is fair use? Fair use allows you to reuse copyright-protected material under certain circumstances without getting permission from the copyright owner. Fair use is an exception to copyright law and is not determined by YouTube. Let me say that again. YouTube does not decide what is fair use and what isn't. Only the court can do that. What counts as fair use? Different countries have different rules about when it's okay to use material without the copyright owner's permission. In some countries, it's not even called fair use. For example, in the UK, it's referred to as fair dealing. Aside from what your country calls it, courts usually focus on whether your use of another person's song or video is transformative. Basically, they're asking if you added new expression or meaning to the original work, or if it basically copies the original. For example, in the US, content that might be considered fair use includes commentary, criticism, or news reporting. Also, keep in mind that just because you say something's fair use, give credit to the copyright owner, or add a disclaimer like no infringement intended, it does not mean that you're protected. How is fair use determined by law? Determining fair use is never a cut and dry process. In the US, fair use can only be determined in court by a judge. The judge will look at your case overall based on a few different factors. Here are a few things to keep in mind based on what the courts look at. You're less likely to qualify for fair use if your video merely copies someone else's and adds nothing else, if you're trying to monetize your video, if you're using fictional copyrighted material rather than factual material, if you borrowed a large amount of material rather than a small portion, if the main focus of your video is the copyright protected material, or if your use of the material harms the copyright owner's ability to profit from their original work. So, all of these are helpful factors to consider when thinking about fair use. But also keep in mind there is no guarantee that you'll qualify for fair use just because you take these factors into account. For example, just because you don't monetize your video, or if you only use a small portion of the copyrighted material, that does not mean you automatically qualify for fair use. Again, the courts look at everything holistically, and there's always a risk involved when using someone else's copyrighted work. Think carefully about all of these factors and get legal advice if needed. Companies are claiming just a few seconds of a video. How is that not abuse? One of the biggest myths about fair use is that there's a minimum amount of time you're allowed to use someone else's copyrighted work. But despite what some people may think, there is no duration which you can use someone else's content that is automatically protected under fair use. In fact, courts have rejected fair use arguments for songs that only sample a few seconds of someone else's work. So if you're using any amount of content that you don't own, even a few seconds, you're taking a risk of receiving a claim or a takedown. You have the right to argue fair use, but only courts, not YouTube, can ultimately decide whether the use of someone else's content is protected under fair use. Because of this, our approach has been to empower creators to remove claimed content whenever possible if they feel that it isn't adding significant value to their video. That's why we've built tools to help you easily identify the content being claimed in your video and remove or swap out claimed music with copyright-safe tracks from the free YouTube audio library. We're also now requiring claimants to add timestamps to these claims so you know exactly which piece of your video is being claimed. We've also updated our editing tools so that when you remove the content manually claimed in your video, the claim is automatically released, restoring monetization to your video if you were previously monetizing. Why does my content, which is clearly fair use, keep getting claimed by Content ID? Automated systems like Content ID can't determine fair use, which is a subjective case-by-case decision that can only be made by a court. While YouTube can't arbitrate fair use disputes, and automated systems like Content ID can account for fair use, this doesn't mean that fair use can't exist on YouTube. If you're a creator, you should avoid relying on fair use unless you understand how the rules work and you're prepared to defend your position through the Content ID dispute process and potentially the counter notification process. This forces the claimant to withdraw or to file a lawsuit. This isn't a decision that should be taken lightly or without legal advice, but it is the most powerful step you can take if you want to pursue a fair use defense and will force the most thoughtful review from the claimant.
Using music, sound effects, and audio clips in your podcast required a clear understanding of licensing to avoid legal issues. Licensing types include Creative Commons, allows use of content under specific conditions like attributing the creator. Royalty-free, permits content usage without ongoing fees but may still require an initial purchase. It's essential to verify the exact terms of each license, as some may limit commercial use or require attribution, while fair use might apply in cases like a commentary or criticism. Its nuanced area in podcasting and misinterpretation can lead for legal issues. For example, incorporated a short music clip could be covered by fair use, but it's generally best to use licensed or original content to avoid risks. And about fair use, it's fair to tell that it's working in the US, for example. Yes, in Western countries. In Kazakhstan, the situation with using fair use is totally different. We don't have such thing as a fair use in our law system. Hopefully it will be improved and content makers will have opportunity, yes, to use the content for educational, informative purposes because the law supports them. Contracts with sponsors and guests. Establishing formal agreements with sponsors and guests is essential for managing expectations and protecting your podcast legally. For sponsors, contracts should cover payment terms, specify compensation amounts, timelines, and payment methods. AD content detail the content of advertisements, including who creates the ad copy and any restrictions on language or claims. Usage rights. Usage rights define how and where the sponsor ads will appear and for how long. For guests, a written agreement ensures that they consent to the recording, distribution, and potential monetization of the episode. Clear terms regarding permission and usage rights protect your ability to share and promote episodes without facing future disputes over guest participation. This formality also establishes mutual respect and professionalism, building trust with sponsors and guests alike.
In today's episode, you'll learn if you should send your guests a release form before you start recording your interview. Welcome to Podcasting Q&A, where you learn the best tips and strategies to launch, grow, and monetize your show. This week's question comes from Paul.
Hello, my name is Paul Merrick, and my question is simply, how important and prudent should we be with having guests sign releases before they're on our show? Thank you.
Thanks for your question, Paul. Guest release forms are one of those things that you'll hear a lot about in the podcasting industry, but you won't necessarily find a consensus answer. There are those that subscribe to the idea that you absolutely should have your guests sign a release form before you record the interview. And then on the other side, you'll have those that say they're not really necessary. So in this episode, we'll share two perspectives and help you decide which one's going to be the best for your particular podcast. And to help me with this episode, I reached out to our good friend Gordon at thepodcastlawyer.com to hear his perspective on whether or not you should use a release form for your podcast.
What a release form is it's a document that takes care of a couple of things. One is the consent to record. Now, a lot of people think, well, I'm in a one-party state, and there's all this talk about one-party and two-party states. And, that's a wiretap statute that makes it a crime to record people without their consent. That wiretap statute is not going to help you much if somebody sues you for violating their privacy or for fraud and lying to them about what you're doing or those kinds of things. The other thing that it does, it gives you permission to use that recording in any way you want, forever and ever, throughout the world, the universe, in perpetuity, which, that's the fancy legal language. And it also gives you a little bit of more flexibility to sort of embellish and edit and those kinds of things. Basically, the person is saying, I understand you're going to use it and you're going to cut it and you're going to do these things, and I'm not going to sue you. So it's a promise not to sue and the consent to record and use. And I think it's very important.
The natural pushback that I hear from podcasters that are like, that sounds like you're worrying about something that isn't really a problem. I've never had a problem with the guests. Why is that something that I should worry about?
I'll tell you a little story about one of my clients that sort of fell into a problem with this. She had a podcast around the parenting space, and in particular around new babies and mothering new children. And she had an expert on her show several times, actually. And this was one of these true believer, diehard, it has to be breast milk, there can be no formula, that kind of thing. And that's fine. She presented a perspective, and my client was a trained journalist, actually. And so she presented the perspective, had the episode up. A year or two later, she has some other subject matter on the show that talks about formula. Well, this lactation expert says, that's it, we're done. Take all my episode down, take everything down, not a single reference to me on your podcast website at all. Well, the journalist and my client said, well, that's not cool. She presented her side and we should present the other side. So she said, well, great. You write something for me to put up in its place explaining why you've had me take this down, and I'll be happy to do it. The guest says no way and files a lawsuit. That lawsuit cost my client many tens of thousands of dollars. And she ended up taking it down, which wouldn't have had to happen if this release had been signed.
So what you're saying is best case scenario, it'll never be a problem. When you have these guest release forms, you'll never have to use them again. You can file them away in a deep folder on your computer hard drive somewhere. Worst case scenario, you have it as a safety net to make sure that you are protected from, some of these outlier cases that you may think may never happen to you until they do. And then you're wishing you had just had them sign this little piece of paper.
Exactly right. And, the other thing is you don't have to abide by your own rule that you're going to keep it up forever. If somebody comes to you and says, really need you to take that down because I said something embarrassing, my wife doesn't like what I said about her, something like that, discretion's a better part of valor, but it's your choice to make, not the guests.
Where do I get my hands on a form like that? And is it going to be a 17-page PDF document written in legalese that neither I nor my guest can understand?
Well, the one that I like, of course, is the one that I wrote, and I offer it available for free. You can go to podcastrelease.com. And if you're doing video and other stuff, I have one for that too. It's called guestrelease.com. It's a little bit legalese. I mean, it has to be, but that's also part of the professional image that you need to project.
So the first approach is to send your guests a legal document that they sign, giving you permission to use the interview in whatever way you see fit. But if you don't want to go through the process of sending them a document, having them sign it, return it to you, saving it somewhere to use sometime in the future, there is another way to essentially accomplish the same goal. And that is when you start recording your podcast interview, you simply go down the list of things that you're going to do with the podcast episode you're about to record and get their verbal approval. We actually talked about this recently on an episode of Buzzcast, and Albin shared what he does whenever he reaches out to guests to record interviews for Buzzsprout podcasts.
All right, so I'll jump on this one.
As our resident lawyer.
Yeah, I am a lawyer, but I am not your lawyer, and I'm not giving you legal advice. But let me give you my take on it. What we've actually done, Travis and I did a video interview that'll probably come out on the YouTube channel. After we start recording, that's when I say, so we're recording this video. Here's how we're going to use it. Here's how we will incorporate your answers into future videos. Is that okay? And then they say yes. And we cover all of the bases with just a very simple, normal human person question of, hey, this is what I plan to do. Are you okay with that? And then when they say yes, then there's no confusion. And so now we've gotten on the same page.
So which approach is going to be best for you? Well, if you want to cross all your T's, dot all your I's, and never have to lose sleep ever again that a guest is going to come back weeks, months, or years later and say, I want you to take down that podcast episode because I don't like what you did with it, send them a guest release form, a legal document that they sign that you then can say, hey, sorry, you gave me the ability to use this however I wanted to. But if you're willing to take a more laid back approach where you give your guests the ability to provide their input on the editing of the podcast episodes, and it's more of a give and take process with your guests, then you can absolutely just do the verbal agreement at the beginning of your podcast episode, and you should be totally fine.
Disclosures and advertising regulations. When monetizing your podcast, it's crucial to follow Federal Trade Commission, FTC. It's fair for the US, yes, so that's why in Kazakhstan, please pay attention that there could be different law guidelines to maintain transparency with your audience. Usually, this rule mandates clear and conspicuous disclosures for any sponsorships or affiliate links to inform listeners about paid promotions. For example, to comply with these regulations, start sponsor segments with phrasing like, this episode is brought to you by, or we are partnering with sponsor name to bring you this episode. Such phrasing helps listener easily identify paid content, fostering trust. Disclosing affiliate links similar is crucial. So clarify to listeners that you may earn a commission when they make a purchase through your links. So now coming to some case study, yes, intellectual property misuse in podcast. Avoid legal pitfall, unauthorized use of music or content. The issue, of course, using copyrighted music, sound effects, or even clips from other media without permission can lead to copyright infringement issues. This is a common mistake, especially if podcasters assume that short clips fall under fair use, which is rarely applicable in podcasting. Solution tip: always check for content licenses. Use royalty-free music, Creative Commons licensed material, or purchase a license. Some music libraries provide license specifically for podcast use, making it easier to avoid legal issues. The estate of George Carlin has settled a legal dispute with two podcasters over their unauthorized artificial intelligence-generated comedy routine, imitating the legendary comedian, according to filings in California federal court, so please pay attention to this video.
Joining us now, Joshua Schiller. He's an attorney representing Carlin's family estate. Thank you for being with us this morning. At what point did your clients become aware of this podcast and the use of George Carlin's voice?
Almost instantaneously, because it made such a sensation on the internet, as these things are prone to do these days. But Kelly Carlin, who's George Carlin's only daughter, immediately saw it and immediately reacted on Twitter, and received an outcrying of immediate support in response to what people clearly saw as an inappropriate theft of intellectual property.
Let's get to the personal side of it just for a moment here, and then we can talk about the legal implications. But for her to hear her father's voice in this type of special, how did that land with her and others close to him?
She was deeply offended that anyone would try to do that. Disassociating the family side of it. She's a protector of her father's legacy and his important contribution to our culture, and in particular to comedy. And so she felt both responsible as the protector of that legacy, as well as offended on a personal level.
So before taking the step to sue the media company and these podcast hosts, did you all reach out to them and try to understand better what was going on? What was the next step once you realized it was out there?
We filed the suit pretty quickly after being engaged. This captured such a incredible amount of publicity very quickly. We felt it was important to file our lawsuit, which caused them to take the video down immediately. But it doesn't repair the injury of what's going on, because this video exists. It's been circulated all over the internet, and we'll have to take a lot of steps in order to try to remove the thing permanently. And that's a complicated process to do.
So the claims of AI, those are no longer valid in your understanding. They're now saying it was a fictional podcast character created by two human beings. What's your legal strategy to combat that?
Well, we don't know if it's the truth or not, right? That's a comment that they made in an evasive manner as they were taking the video off their own website and doing nothing else from what I can tell on Friday afternoon. Whether they're telling the truth or not, we'll talk to them about that. In the case, there'll be depositions, document production, and other elements that will reveal the facts. But regardless, they still violated the intellectual property of Mr. Carlin by attempting to use his likeness to sell their video. And it begs a lot of questions. Why did they lie to their audience? What was the purpose of using his reputation and goodwill in order to get people to watch your video?
So prior to the release of the video and the podcast, what was shared with the audience about what they were about to hear?
Well, there's a number of comments that they made. That there's still about 8 or 9 videos up on their website that you can see where they're talking about the video. And some of it's discussed in our complaint, but they talked about resurrecting George Carlin. They talked about how this video shows the new George Carlin, but they were clearly trying to take advantage of two things, right? Technology and the importance and the wide recognition we all have in the multiple and incredible uses of AI right now. And then also capturing the legacy of someone who was phenomenal, controversial, but really a game-changing, altering figure in brilliant content. And a mentor to many comedians as well. And here they are taking one of the great legacies, taking this technology, and what they're showing us is the dangers involved in it, whether they wrote it or not. The ability of a voice modulator to create a voice and create the impression of someone who's no longer with us, or frankly, to create an impression of someone who's alive, as we learned was happening in New Hampshire during the primaries. There were robocalls impersonating President Biden. There are a lot of dangers associated with this technology, and this lawsuit is demonstrating one of them.
One of podcasting advantages is its simplicity in distribution. Podcasts don't need complex streaming software. Instead, they rely on a simple file upload model. Once you place an audio file on your web server, all that's required is an update to your RSS feed. This feed update notifies podcast directories, listeners, and apps that a new episode is available for download. By separating your media hosting from your website hosting, you can ensure your podcast files are reliably accessible without overloading your web infrastructure. So the podcast hosting vs website hosting. So website hosting for podcast content is the central hub for podcast information, updates, and listener engagement. It houses show notes, episode details, blog posts, and any additional content that supports your podcast, but it doesn't necessarily need to store your actual audio files. This keeps your website efficient and accessible, especially for those visitors who come primarily for information rather than direct streaming. Podcast-specific hosting platforms, yes, they designed for podcasts like Libsyn, Podbean, or Anchor are equipped to handle large audio files. They offer stable servers, ample storage, and the high bandwidth necessary for streaming on downloaded audio episodes. These platforms often provide analytics, scheduling, and direct distribution to major podcast directories, which simplifies the process for you and helps listeners find your content more easily. RSS, really simple syndication. feeds were initially created to syndicate news, allowing users to see new content from various sites. For podcasts, RSS feeds contain episode files and metadata, so when an episode is published, it automatically updates for subscribers across podcast apps. Most podcast hosting services generate an RSS feed for you and automatically update it each time a new episode is uploaded, saving you time. Submitting your podcast to directories to make your podcast available to a wide audience. Submit your RSS feed to popular directories like Apple Podcast, Spotify, Google Podcast, and Stitcher. This allows listeners to find and subscribe to your podcast on their favorite platforms. Each directory has unique submission guidelines, but generally it's a one-time process, after which new episodes will appear in subscribers' feeds automatically.
Every time you visit your favorite website searching for new content and find none, you waste time. RSS feeds are a way to eliminate this process by bringing all of the latest content directly to you in one place. Let's say you check multiple blogs every day. Normally, you just go to each of them one by one looking for new content. But with RSS feeds, they're all in the same place. You can even make that place your homepage, a desktop icon, or an app on your phone. So what is RSS? RSS stands for Really Simple Syndication. It's ugly code that looks a lot like HTML. It's not user-friendly because it's not designed for people, it's designed for programs. These programs make RSS something that's pleasant to look at and easy to use, but we'll get to that in a bit. You can do a lot with RSS. For example, you can easily subscribe to all of your favorite news sites and organize them under a single folder called News. With services like Buffer and Hootsuite, you can automatically post content from your website to your social media accounts using RSS feeds. And with services like MailChimp, you can email your latest content directly to your subscribers. Okay, reasons you may be interested in using RSS. You are not comfortable subscribing to email newsletters. You use the internet at the pace of a turtle and/or type slower than a 4-year-old. Your internet is terribly slow. And you frequently read blogs or listen to podcasts. All right, so how to get started with RSS. To get started with RSS, you need something called an RSS reader. As of today, these are the most popular free readers. There are lots to choose from, so here's the 3 most popular readers. You can find them in the video description below. As this video ages, these readers may become outdated, so just search Best RSS Readers. Deciding which reader to choose ultimately comes down to preference. Just about everyone seems to use a different RSS reader. Next, you're going to want to subscribe to your favorite websites. Now that you have an RSS feed reader, you'll need to be on the lookout for the RSS icon. It looks like this. There's also older icons that look like this, but RSS buttons can look like just about anything. When you find the button, click it, and it will give you the information you need to get started. Sometimes you'll get an ugly page with code on it. If you get this page, copy the URL, go to the reader, look for something that says add subscription or add content, click it, and paste the URL. An RSS feed address could look just like a normal web address. For example, a feed could be something like this or this. Now that you've added your favorite websites, whenever these websites release new content, they will go directly to your RSS reader. That's it. It's that simple. Side note, some people say RSS is dead. And kind of. Many websites neglect RSS and instead use email newsletters, Facebook, or Twitter to notify fans of new content. However, for the world of podcasting, blogging, and news, RSS is very much alive and quite useful. Most blogs or news websites still use RSS, and nearly every podcast, including Growth Origin, uses an RSS feed. It's how feeds like iTunes and Google Play collect the newest episodes from thousands of podcasters. So that's everything you need to know to get started with RSS. Happy RSS. RSSing? RSS feeding. Yeah, happy RSS feeding.
So we covered essential legal basics, protecting your podcast brand, following licensing rules, and ensuring clear sponsor agreements. So we also looked at effective distribution from RSS feeds to podcast directories to maximize your reach. So see you in the next part of this lecture.